So, we've been doing coverage on Venezuela. What's been happening in Venezuela is that it turns out Venezuela has twice the amount of oil reserves as Saudi Arabia. And so the United States, of course, needs to bring democracy to their people. And we've been exposing the BS propaganda from Trump's White House, the State Department, what was coming from Elliot Abrams and John Bolton. They admitted this was for oil. John Bolton literally admitted on Fox News that this would be good for our oil companies. And so we've been helping debunk that. And people who've been on the ground there have been people like Max Blumenthal with the Gray Zone Project. And also what has been going on is the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. Well, here's from the Gray Zone's reporting. In April and May, Washington-backed Venezuelan coup leaders began taking over properties in the United States that belonged to the internationally recognized government of Venezuela's democratically elected president, Nicolas Maduro, in violation of international law. So the United States government is in bed with the quote-unquote opposition to Nicolas Maduro, the elected president of Venezuela, and that's a guy named Juan Guaido. He's the head of the quote-unquote opposition. So the United States is trying to push Juan Guaido on the Venezuelan people in a similar way we push the Shah on the people of Iran, right? So they're trying to do that. And why? Because he's in bed with U.S. corporations, U.S. financiers, and, of course, U.S. fossil fuel companies. Juan Guaido is. And so then the United States government started letting them take over properties in the United States, including the Venezuelan embassy. A group of activists responded by keeping a vigil inside the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., in order to protect it from an illegal seizure by the U.S.-supported coup leaders. So there were literally people trying to take over the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., who were not sanctioned by the Venezuelan government. The activists formed what they called the Embassy Protection Collective. The internationally recognized Venezuelan government gave them permission to stay in its embassy, which is its own sovereign territory under international law. So the United States would be breaking international law, of course, by allowing those quote-unquote opposition party to take over the Venezuelan embassy. In response, hordes of right-wing activists who supported the Venezuelan opposition launched a de facto 24/7 siege on the embassy, preventing people, food, and supplies from entering the building. So they wouldn't let any food or supplies or anything they needed, the people who were occupying the Venezuelan embassy, rightfully and lawfully so. So Max Blumenthal went down there. He helped bring food to the people inside the Venezuelan embassy, and check out, he was arrested, right? And so, and just to give you a quick look at what was going on out there, so they would have hordes of right-wing activists who want to overthrow the democratically elected president in Venezuela and give the control of the government over to corporations and oil companies. There's Code Pink. So everybody's out there protesting, and then they would also, the protesters were very violent against who? Okay, of course the right-wing protesters violent again. Look at this. So they're harassing Anya Parampel. She's a journalist who we actually talked to on the show when she was inside the Venezuelan embassy. And this guy's like, they're all being aggressive with her, clapping right in her face. I have other video of them just calling her the most racist names. And of course, the cops don't do anything. The cops are on the side of the right-wing coup that is trying to take over the democratically elected government. So now let's bring in Max Blumenthal. He's our guest, and he's known for his work as an editor at The Gray Zone. He co-hosts of The Moderate Rebels, and he's author of the book, I got it right here, The Management of Savagery. It's Max Blumenthal. Hey, Max, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
So, Max, people on the show are familiar with your work. You help debunk the United States government propaganda in all over, in Syria, in Venezuela, which we're most, you debunked New York Times reporting and CNN's reporting on garbage propaganda. So you've been doing great work on Venezuela. You went to the Venezuelan embassy when you tried to bring food. So tell us what happened.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everyone who's been showing me solidarity and support since the news of this arrest on a completely false, fabricated, phony, bogus lie of a charge became public. The solidarity has been amazing. It's come from so many quarters, so many other countries, and I just want to tell everyone first how much it means to me and how important it is to make noise about this. As far as what happened, I'm completely innocent of what I'm being charged with, which is simple assault. It's a fabricated charge by the Venezuelan opposition, and the facts are going to speak for themselves. If the government wants to take this sham of a lie of a case to court. The facts are going to speak very loudly. That's really all I can say about that. Once again, I'm completely innocent. I've been falsely charged, and it's outrageous.
So tell us. So this happened months ago. Why did you just get arrested now?
That's a great question. You know, the incident that's described in the arrest warrant for me took place in May. And so 5 months later, and another person, Ben Rubenstein, who is the brother of Alex Rubenstein, a reporter who has contributed to the Gray Zone and Mint Press and other sites, who was embedded inside the embassy with the Gray Zone's Anya Parampil. Ben Rubenstein was arrested the following day when he appeared outside the embassy, but there was no warrant for my arrest. I was told by a source close who's familiar with the case and the material that a judge initially rejected a warrant for my arrest. Then, for some reason, last Friday morning, a team of cops appeared at my door, threatening to break down my door. They had taken positions on the side of my house, as if they're some kind of SWAT team or like I'm a flight risk or something. And they came into my house. I had to decide, do I want them to take an eye bar to my door and violently barge into my house, or do I let them in? I decided, I let them in under this threat of vandalizing my house. And then I had 4 or 5 armed officers inside my house. They had a paddy wagon outside for me. It looked like they'd come in unmarked cars. And they were menacing, and they gave me, I basically had to negotiate with them to be able to put on my coat before I left. And I was pretty much wearing my pajamas. So I left in my pajamas and a coat, and they threw me in a paddy wagon. And then I was subsequently denied the right to call a lawyer for the whole 36 hours that I was in jail. And I can talk more about the experience that I had in there. But the question is, why was this warrant executed in such a fashion 5 months after I was falsely accused? I believe that this is clearly a case of political persecution, and it's part of a wider campaign of political persecution against me and the Gray Zone for doing the factual journalism that we do to expose the lies behind the U.S. regime change wars and economic warfare, and for being part of a very small handful of reporters outside the embassy who are documenting the violence, the racism, and the sexism of the Venezuelan opposition that was besieging the embassy.
Yes. So, go into what, so the point of right now, everybody's making a big deal about the way Trump treats the press. And everybody's virtue signaling about when they stand up for and defend a guy named Jim Acosta.
Yeah.
When he grandstands against Trump over over nothing, right? Over his involvement with a stripper. That's Jim Acosta's work. So but when it comes to real journalism, stuff like what you do or stuff like what Julian Assange does, the press is silent. They're just sycophants. They're just corporate go-alongs. They're just trying to get ahead in their career. They're careerists. They're not really journalists. They really don't care about the truth. They just want a job. They could be doing this or working for Raytheon. It doesn't matter. In fact, they do indirectly work for Raytheon, most of them. So the point being that you're actually being persecuted for doing journalism, and you're being persecuted by the United States government. So that was the DC cops, and they're acting on orders from who? Who knows, right? Who knows where these orders come from? Because it's, the Venezuelan opposition is in bed with the State Department and the CIA and everybody else. So we don't know where these orders came from, but they came. And the way they arrested you, they could have just as easily called you up and said, "There's a warrant out for your arrest. Would you come down to the police station?" And I'm sure you would have, right?
Exactly. I have nothing to fear because I'm completely innocent. This is an absolute lie. So if they had just called me, I would have shown up for an arraignment. But instead, what I had to deal with was first being thrown in 7th District, down where I live, being denied a phone call. Then, first of all, being transported in a paddy wagon. You can actually see how someone like Freddie Gray would have been fatally injured if the driver decided to, whip the van around wildly. You're handcuffed and you are in a really tight space, and you have a little bit of rope to hold on to you behind you. And then, you're thrown into a cell with a bunch of guys. Then you're transported again in the paddy wagon. Then I was thrown into a cell for like 14 hours to sit on to lie on a metal slab until the following day because I had missed the cut for my arraignment, which meant that I had to wait for an entire new ingestion of prisoners and to wait in various cages with them with various different types of handcuffs or shackles on. At one point, I was shackled for over 5 hours in a cage with 10 men that was about 60 degrees. And at one point, I mean, it was impossible to get up off the floor in these kind of shackles. I mean, it was just an extremely unpleasant experience. And it appears that the government designed it that way by not giving me the opportunity to just show up at my own arraignment. And that just highlights the persecution and the political nature of this case.
So this is clear intimidation by the government on a journalist for doing journalism that is counter to the government's narrative. This is obvious that's what this is. Now, I'm sure Jim Acosta's reached out to you, and he's probably done a story about it already.
Oh, yeah. I'm getting lots of support from CNN and the New York Times. And, democracy dies in darkness at the Washington Post, and they're shining lots of light on this. Actually, that's
Dave Weigel hasn't
sarcastic.
Done a story about that? You're telling me Dave Weigel, the defender of democracy, hasn't done a story about this yet?
Yeah. I mean, Washington Post had a reporter outside the embassy who was covering a lot of what was going on, completely from the opposition side. She covered, a trip that the members of the Embassy Protection Collective took to Venezuela, and I participated in that trip, and she framed it in as negative a light as possible. But this, would seem relevant to the coverage of the embassy, and I've heard nothing from the Washington Post. The Committee to Protect Journalists, of course, has nothing to say about this so far. And
what is that? I never heard of that. Can you tell me what that is?
Well, it's sort of a corporate funded NGO that basically focuses on defending journalists in countries where the U.S. wants regime change. And, doesn't seem to say much about journalists like me. We see all these human rights groups and all of these NGOs and U.S. reporters, even, mainstream reporters, they howl about a journalist who gets detained for a few hours in Venezuela or journalists who get jailed in Russia. But this is happening right in the middle of Washington, D.C. And, there's silence from their side. At the same time, I have gotten enormous amounts of solidarity from people, and that's really encouraging. But this is telling. It's very telling. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that I have played a role in exposing mainstream media and their partnership with the national security state in spreading all of these lies. For example, that back in February 23rd, you remember when Juan Guaido and his crew were going to ram through humanitarian aid to Venezuela with USAID and all these, Marco Rubio was on the Colombian border. He was up till like 3 a.m. tweeting. He was really geeking out. And they made up this phony story that Venezuelan government forces burned the aid trucks when it turned out that it was Guaido's own thugs, including, now we know, members of Colombian paramilitaries who had burned the aid. And, we at the Gray Zone exposed that before any English language media did so. So we've been breaking down these false narratives. And also on Syria, we were, one of the few sites that was exposing the White Helmets, a U.S. and UK funded influence operation, and their connection with U.S. backed armed Salafi jihadi insurgents in Syria. And now it's clear who the White Helmets are, because they participated in Turkey's ethnic cleansing of Afrin in northern Syria. And we see the same so-called moderate rebels that we've been exposing and you've been talking about, Jimmy, for years, now are Turkish mercenaries who are slaughtering Kurds and committing ethnic cleansing in northern Syria, working with Erdogan. And it's just like all of these collapsing narratives, I think we've played a part in collapsing them, but especially on Venezuela. I mean, we've had Anya Parampil exposing Carlos Vecchio, the fake U.S. ambassador who is stage managing these forces around the embassy, as basically part of a white-collar corrupt mafia that is trying to liquidate Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset in Citgo. We've just been at the forefront of exposing all of this. And now 5 months later, I have cops show up at my house to execute a warrant on a completely false charge. We have to just put two and two together. It's very clearly connected. And what we need to do is gather, we need to demonstrate the collusion between violent right-wing Venezuelan opposition members and the federal government to get revenge on reporters who exposed their corruption and their violence. I mean, there's just so much documentation of the violence of these Venezuelan opposition fanatics outside the embassy. And, back to this phony case against me, they were getting very, very bad PR at the time that they concocted this charge. So they held a press conference and they basically made these phony allegations at a time when they were being exposed in broad daylight on video by reporters like Alex Rubinstein, by me, by Anya Parampil, for the acts of violence and racism that they were committing outside the embassy. And anyone can just go to YouTube and dig up video of them and you'll see it for yourself. Go back into our Twitter timelines back in April and May and you'll see it. What you won't see is us committing violence because we were not violent.
Yeah. I watched those videos. It was amazing to watch the government law enforcement from the United States. They're protecting the illegal activities of the right-wing people who wanted to illegally take over the Venezuelan embassy. That's pretty amazing to see. But of course, they were allowed to do it because they had the backing of the State Department, the United States government. And it would be, I can't wait to see your reporting when you figure out, who gave this order to go ahead and arrest you. It's the Trump administration. It's the Justice Department. It's the federal government. We know that. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Yeah, I mean, I would like to know the person.
Yeah.
And what and who inside the DC Police Department thought it was a good idea to show such an overwhelming show of force while arresting a journalist? That's another question. Who's the commanding officer? Where did he get his order? Why wouldn't they just send one officer to your house to say we have a warrant? Why would they send a SWAT team to a journalist's house unless they're trying to intimidate journalists and to get them to stop doing a certain type of journalism? That's exactly what this looks like. That's probably exactly what it is. So that's why I'd like to know who the guy is at the DC Police Department who said, who made the phone call, give me the SWAT team, give me 10 other officers, who was the guy who orchestrated this at the DC Police Department? It had to be somebody. That's what I'm talking about.
Again, I mean, it's the federal government and and whoever's prosecuting this that had the opportunity to tell me there was a warrant for this phony charge. And they made a choice to set things up the way that they were executed. And honestly, I grew up in DC. I know how the police are here. I've never really had a positive experience with a police officer in DC. So when they show up in your house, in your living room, and they're jumpy because they don't know who's there or whatever, it's somewhat terrifying. And I had to have an officer follow me to get my coat. He wasn't going to allow me to change my clothes without watching me, because, and then I noticed that there were police all along the side of my house, waiting for me to jump out of a window or something. It was ridiculous. And I essentially had to kind of, at one point he did try to cuff me. He said I was taking too long because it's early in the morning and all of a sudden there's cops in your living room. So it was a fairly terrifying experience. And then the next thing I know, I'm in a dark paddy wagon, handcuffed, holding onto a rope, as the police proceed to go around and pick up my neighbors, various people on petty crimes, which is a whole another aspect of this experience, was to just see the sheer racism of the U.S. justice system. I mean, it's just outrageous what you see behind bars. And that's another thing that the corporate media doesn't report on. While they're howling about Jim Acosta because Donald Trump was mean to him, and calls CNN fake news, they have very little to say about the young black men I spent 2 days with in prison who are basically there for the pettiest of crimes imaginable and are being subjected to similarly horrible treatment and being denied the access to phone calls as well.
So now, I thought, so that's probably illegal that they denied you counsel, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was only because people from the outside knew that I'd been arrested, that they were able to call attorneys on my behalf. But otherwise no one would have known I was there at all. And again, I spent 36 hours there.
How did you finally get released?
Basically, you just have to go through this long bureaucratic process, with like anal searches in between, and being, with long periods of shackling. And I just waited in a cage at the end of it behind a courtroom, and then I was led out into the courtroom, and the judge let me go on my own recognizance. I got to see her send other people to holding cells for several days. I mean, but I was let go because the prosecutor said, you can go on your own recognizance.
Why did the prosecutor say that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get into any details, but that's the way it went down. And,
okay.
Then I was let out and I walked out in the street in my pajamas.
So, yeah, I mean, so this is what the government does to journalists who are onto them, right? This will never happen to Jim Acosta, but this will happen because he'll never break a story that actually exposes anything inside the government.
Because who's next? Who's next? I mean, the stakes are really high, and I thought about Julian Assange a lot when I was in there. Obviously, I'm not Julian Assange. I don't want to compare myself to him. I'm just saying I thought of how he's being treated for the crime of journalism. I thought about Jeremy Hammond, who's been doing, I think, a 10-year sentence. And unless I heard wrong, his sentence was just extended for the most absurd reasons. And thought of a lot of people while I was in there, but especially Assange.
Yeah. And doesn't it kind of blow your mind to see people who were prosecuted by the Barack Obama administration, like James Risen, now totally turn into a mouthpiece for the CIA?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't blow my mind.
Really?
It's sort of like coming home and getting back in the good graces of the establishment by accepting the narrative of Russiagate. And, that's what happens, you look at the transformation of The Intercept as soon as they started hiring a bunch of New York Times retreads. It's kind of like indistinguishable in many ways from the New York Times. And Risen is one of them. I mean, just to see his arguments against Greenwald on Russiagate just have completely fallen apart, and there's been no accountability.
None.
Same with Robert Mackey, another New York Times retread that The Intercept hired. His everything he wrote about Duma the alleged chemical attack on Duma, which has completely fallen apart with the OPCW whistleblower report coming out, and you actually have one of the first directors of the OPCW getting to take a look at that report and meet the whistleblower and declaring that basically the whole narrative around Duma is phony. We were lied to, and Syria was attacked on the basis of a lie. And, Aaron Mate at the Gray Zone at his show Pushback has really also been at the forefront of exposing these collapsing narratives.
I just got smeared again on Twitter by that Danny Gold guy.
Yeah.
Do you know who that is?
Yeah, he's just someone who's been pushing for U.S. intervention in Syria and regime change while working at Vice, which is, the hipster arm of imperialism. And, he's someone who I saw cheerleading my arrest.
Yes, I saw that too.
And so as I said, this is part of a wider campaign of political persecution. I'm going to be talking about the wider campaign more in the coming days. And, it really reveals that these people, they don't only want to discredit me or personally denigrate me. They really want to see me thrown in jail indefinitely. So while they're claiming to care about political prisoners in countries where the U.S. wants to topple the government, they're seeking to jail someone who's their ideological opponent in the U.S. That's what they say. They're hoping they're basically cheering on my arrest and prosecution by the government. They're the real authoritarians. They're our local homegrown U.S. authoritarians, and they run around posing as pro-democracy liberals. It's the hypocrisy couldn't be more clear right now.
Next live Jimmy Dore show is in Philadelphia, November 18th. Plus, we'll be in Honolulu on December 27th doing live shows all month long in November and December in Hollywood at the Sycamore Tavern. Plus, we're going to be in San Jose, Sacramento, Tempe, Portland. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all the tickets for all of our live shows. And please become a patron if you like the show. We give you hours of bonus material every week. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com and become a premium member. Thanks for your support.